One of the three kind of Mount Rushmore of amplifiers is none other than the Marshall Plexi. However, one thing as a pedal maker that's always confused me about using the term Marshall Plexi is that it seems to me that a lot of people don't have a reference point for what that sound actually is. Now, there's been a lot of great videos that talk about the history of the Marshall Plexi. Rhett Shull has done a wonderful video about how the Plexi came to be and how it was inspired and the great players that used it. And if you're interested in that, you can check it out in our description. And I'll also show a little photo of the thumbnail above so it's easy for you to find it. But my particular gripe is not so much in the historical context of the Plexi, but it's in the actual way that it sounds. The argument is really about the Plexi being this high gain monster, because I think everybody says, oh, I need a real Plexi sound. And I think what they're actually thinking of is Marshalls later into the 70s and 80s. There weren't master volumes on these original Marshall Plexi amplifiers that most people revere as kind of being the iconic tone. And most players that we think about that use Plexis were almost invariably either using pedals to help get more gain out of the amplifier so that they would distort and have a nicer kind of lead tone, or they were even cascading Marshalls together and slaving them like guys like Eddie Van Halen would do. And so we're going to talk about how the actual Plexi sounds. I have an original vintage late 60s Superlead 100 here that we're going to use as our exemplar. And I think you're really going to see that this is a fairly clean amp and is not as dirty as so many people give it credit for. If you think about the historical context for this amp as kind of being an answer to the Fender equivalents of something, let's say it was like a Showman or a Twin Reverb where they were high headroom, almost 100-watt clean amps. This was sort of the British Marshall equivalent to compete with those sorts of amps. The Marshall is still a clean amp for much of the way through the volume control, and the volume becomes just overwhelmingly loud before the point that it starts to distort. So let's get into the tones. Let's see what this thing sounds like. Let's start this experiment so we can get to the core, to the root of what this actually sounds like, and is it really as gainy or distorted of a sound as some people give it credit for? Before we get into this conversation about Marshalls, however, I want to remind people to subscribe. Only about 30% of you on any given video are actually subscribers of the channel, so I know lots of you are enjoying the content, and if you are, definitely make sure that you subscribe, hit the like button if you like this content. That's just going to help keep you up to date with all the new videos that we're coming out with every single week. So first, let's create a baseline for what this amplifier sounds like at a couple of different levels. I'm going to be switching between my Strat and a Les Paul, so you can hear it in kind of two different contexts of the most common guitars that you'd find out there. I'm going to play each guitar at a bedroom level using the Superlead 100. Then I'm going to go to 50% of the volume, so have all the knobs at 5 as far as the volume controls are concerned. And then I'm going to dime it and go fully out, 10 on both the volume controls. And again, I have these channels jumpered so I can use both the volume controls. So you can hear how it sounds in two different types of speakers. You'll hear it with the greenback, which is definitely a very colorful speaker that adds a lot of speaker distortion. And then you'll get to hear it with an EVM 12L, which is a very linear speaker and really lets the amp do the talking. So you're going to get to hear them in both contexts with both types of speakers, and you're going to get to hear them at 3 different volume levels, from what would be a bedroom volume to 5, which is definitely a stage volume, and then 10, which is just insanely loud and very distorted. So you're going to get to hear it at all those different levels. So you really have a baseline for what this actual amplifier produces at different levels and with different speakers. So you've heard what it does with the EVM 12L. You've heard what it does with the greenback. Certainly there's a lot more darkness and also a lot more distortion associated with the greenback sound. Is very easy for me to hear, at least in the room. I would say that the thing that I do notice, though, is the more classical sort of plexi sound is certainly very obviously the greenback. That just sounds very Hendrixy, or when you go to kind of more of the Van Halen-ish sounds, it just has that Van Halen vibe. And I know that Van Halen didn't always use greenbacks in all of his cabinets, but it definitely sounds more consistent with what I would have heard in some of those earlier records as opposed to the EVM 12L. Now what I want to do is actually play some clips with the appropriate instruments to kind of do a Hendrix style thing to show firstly what the amp sounds like when with a, a good sound. I don't want to go dimed on this because I feel like we lose some clarity if it gets too loud. I'm going to kind of set it to where I believe it to be the best sound for the example that I'm trying to play. So it'll probably be somewhere around halfway on the volume. And then I'm going to show what it sounds like when I'm playing it at that halfway volume. And then I'm going to introduce the fuzz and back off my volume control just a little bit so that I can get a really nice lead tone out of it that kind of reminds me of, I don't know, that kind of chunky Hendrix style sound. So let's check that out. All right, so you can see the fuzz really offered quite a bit to the overall sound. If I'm just playing that particular part without any sort of distortion pedal engaged or a fuzz in this case, it's just not producing a whole lot of gain to really get the most out of what that amp is doing, and certainly not as a high gain fire breathing monster as some pedals are advertised when they use the term plexi or invoke that word as a part of the sound of the pedal. It's not that distorted when it's on its own. You definitely have to use that pedal, the fuzz face, to goose it a little bit more and to really get the right sound out of it that's kind of consistent with what we would have heard with Jimi Hendrix. But I now want to take this same style of testing and apply it to a Van Halen style sound. So I'm going to switch over my guitar to a Les Paul, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to play a little piece of it with just the Les Paul so you can hear kind of something that's along the lines of a Van Halen type sound. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cascade my Fender Hot Rod DeVille ML into the front of the Plexi. So I'm going to be using my line out box that's connected to the Hot Rod DeVille ML. And I'm going to send that line out, which is basically everything in the amp except for the speaker, into the front of the Plexi. And so I'm basically using my Hot Rod DeVille ML as like a boost or a drive to push harder what the Plexi or the Superlead 100 is already doing in the style that you would see Van Halen often doing, taking a line out box of one Plexi, enslaving it into another, feeding it into that speaker input. So it's basically doing cascaded gain stages using two Marshall heads to achieve that. Again, I don't have two Marshall heads, and certainly the Fender is fairly clean or roughly around the level of cleanliness of the Marshall at this level. So you're going to get to see what that does and how that interacts. So you hear the Marshall by itself first at that level, and then you're going to hear what happens when I cascade the Fender Hot Rod DeVille ML into the front of it using the line out box. So we have cascaded amps to produce that gain sound. So let's hear what that sounds like. So I think you could tell there very obviously it produced a tremendous amount more of gain when we were cascading those two amps together and using the Hot Rod DeVille ML as sort of another gain stage to feed the front or clip harder the input or the preamp section of that Marshall Superlead 100. And it's a really glorious sound. And I wouldn't say that it even took away the definition so much. It just added a little bit more character, a lot more girth, and certainly a little more distortion and a little more edge to it, which really felt great under the fingers and I think also really sounded great. And if you're interested in trying to apply this sort of application using a line out box, we actually have a video on line out boxes where we give different recommendations of brands of line out box and how to run a setup similar to how we did this today to get those two cascading amplifiers in series with each other, kind of slaving one into the other. So definitely check out that video. I'll have a little picture of the thumbnail above, and I'll put a link below if you're interested in checking that out. I think what we've learned from this is the Plexi maybe isn't as distorted as we often think. Again, usually when we think about Plexi sounds, a lot of us immediately go toward high gain distortion or at least heavier gain than what you would consider an ordinary tube screamer or something like that. But the reality is that a Marshall on its own, unless it's at really high volumes, is really not producing any more gain than probably the lowest gain pedals or boosts on your pedal board. It is not a fire-breathing monster, and I can guarantee you that this is a well-functioning standard Superlead 100. Again, this is a 100-watt amp, typically through a 412 speaker. This is not designed as an amp with a master volume. It's single channel. It has two volume controls. If you jumper those channels, you can have the ability to mix them together, but it does not produce a lot of distortion. It has a great sound nonetheless, but you definitely need to be using pedals to get there. So when people talk about Plexi sounds, I'm always confused. Are they talking about just kind of a clean boost pedal that adds a little sparkle? Or are they really talking about a fire-breathing monster? And if that's the case, they probably mean that it's actually more like a JMP era Marshall from the later 70s or a JCM 800 from the earlier part of the 80s, and certainly not those early 60s JTM 45-100s or a Superlead 100 like this from the late 60s. So if you enjoyed this video or you have significant disagreements about the findings of this video, I'd love to hear from you in the comments and get your feedback. And again, I welcome you to subscribe, to like. These are all things that really help out our channel so that if you are interested in seeing content like this, you'll be notified each time we release a video each week. I'd also like to invite you, if you're interested in learning more about pedal boards and rigs, we offer services over on the rigdr.com where you can get one-on-one consultations with me and some of the other people that work with us over there in order to build the pedal board of your dreams or help you troubleshoot some problematic rig that you have at home. Also, if you're interested in buying any of our cables, any of the things that you see that we're connecting to the Marshall today, those are also all available over on the rigdr.com as well as at Sweetwater. And if you're interested in using any pedals like we use today, like the fuzz face or a line out box, we're gonna have some links to newer fuzz faces that can do very much what my older fuzz face does, in addition to a few different line out box options if you're interested in having your Marshalls or your two amplifiers or whatever amplifiers you have cascading into each other in the way that Van Halen used to do. Again, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, aka The Rig Doctor, and that was our video on the Marshall Plexi, or Superlead 100 as it's also known. Thanks for watching. See you later.